Okay. So today we'll be having a class on infertility. It should have been problem-based learning class, but online I don't know how is it possible. So maybe a theory class only on infertility. Okay. So now regarding definition, what is infertility? It is inability to conceive after 1 year of unprotected coitus of reasonable frequency. Okay. So when a couple is unable to conceive after 1 year of unprotected coitus, then we label them as infertile. Okay. But of late they're telling like subfertility is a better term because with treatment they become fertile. So let it be subfertile rather than infertile. But again, the most commonly used term is infertility only. Now, sterility is another term which means, the lady or the couple is completely infertile. Even with treatment, they cannot be fertile. So that is sterility. Now, for incidence, the incidence is 10 to 15%. Infertility incidence is 10 to 15%. And when we talk about the types of infertility, it is primary infertility and secondary infertility. Now, when we talk about primary infertility means the lady has never conceived, okay, irrespective of the outcome of gestation. The lady has never conceived. Not even an abortion, not even an ectopic, nothing. Okay, so that is primary infertility. And when we say somebody is secondary infertility, that means either she has a living issue and maybe now 4 5 years she wants a second issue, but she's not being able to conceive. Then we label her as secondary infertility. Again, suppose she had an abortion or she had an ectopic or she had a molar pregnancy and now she is not being able to conceive, then also we label her as secondary infertility. That means in secondary infertility, the lady has conceived in the past irrespective of the outcome of pregnancy. Okay. Now, after we know what is infertility, we'll try to find out what are the causes of infertility. Now, in the causes of infertility, the male factor causes account for some 30 to 35%. Female factors, another 40%. That means male and female factor contribute equally. Then combined factor is 10 to 15%, where both the male and the female partner is responsible. And then we have the rest unexplained 10 to 15%, where after full investigation of both the partners, we are not being able to find out where is the cause of infertility. There is the male factor, the female factor, the combined factor, and the unexplained factor. Now, let us first talk about the male infertility. Here, the causes are distributed into pre-testicular cause, testicular cause, and post-testicular cause. Okay. So, pre-testicular cause, these are basically causes of male infertility, which are like sort of Coleman's, some syndromes, Coleman syndrome, pituitary failure. The causes are generally limited to hypothalamus or pituitary, then any pituitary tumor, if there's any radiation to cranial radiation affecting the hypothalamus and pituitary, obesity. So these are causes of pre-testicular male infertility. Now, when you come to the testicular causes, you have cryptorchidism. That means the causes of male infertility which are limited to male gonad, that is the testis. Cryptorchidism, okay, undescended testis. Then you have varicocele, orchitis, that means inflammation of the testis, which can be a sequelae to infections like mumps and measles. Then you have chemotherapy, where of any testicular tumor or for any other malignancy as well, but chemotherapy can affect fertility. Then radiation, smoking, and alcohol. Okay, so these are testicular causes of male infertility. Next, you have the post-testicular causes, where the reason is generally if there is any congenital absence of vas, there is cystic fibrosis, where also the vas is, these are like obstructive causes, okay? Then Cartagener syndrome, okay? Then you have premature ejaculation or retrograde ejaculation. These are ejaculatory dysfunctions. So these are post-testicular reasons for male infertility. Now, how do you evaluate male infertility? First, you'll have to take a history, and then where you'll also take history of smoking and intake of alcohol. Then you'll do a physical examination where you can diagnose something called, undescended testis and all. You can find out. Then you'll ask for semen analysis, which is mandatory in all male infertility evaluation, where you'll get to know the semen parameters and then finally label him as infertile and carry on the further management. Then you have certain sperm function tests. You'll do certain endocrinological evaluation like serum follicle stimulating hormone. You'll do luteinizing hormone, prolactin, thyroid, testosterone. All these hormones you do for endocrinological evaluation. Even karyotype is important for some syndromes. Then you have ultrasound where you'll get to know whether the scrotum is empty, whether it is a case of undescended testis. You can also find out with Doppler, varicocele and all. Then finally, you can also go for testicular biopsy. Okay. So this is how you'll evaluate male infertility. And then regarding management of male infertility, after finding out the cause, you'll treat accordingly. Generally, if on semen analysis parameters, you label the male as there are certain terms like azoospermia, means there is no sperm in the semen sample. Okay, so that is known as azoospermia. Then you have certain other conditions like oligozoospermia. So in the semen analysis, according to WHO, you have a chart where you have details of, the sperm count and per ejaculate how much, and then how many should be having progressive motility, how many should be having non-progressive motility, and then you have the morphology, where if the morphological abnormality is more than 4% or something, then it's an abnormal semen parameter. So these are the things. Now, there are certain terms I told you. There's something called azoospermia. That means there is no sperm in the semen sample. Then you have oligozoospermia. That means the number of sperm count is less than that given as cutoff in WHO. You can go through that chart, WHO chart. So that is there. That is not very much required, but at your level. But if you are interested, you can go through. Then you have certain other terms like oligoasthenoteratozoospermia. Teratozoospermia means morphologically abnormal sperms. So all of you must be knowing from your knowledge of embryology that the sperm has a head, neck, body, tail. So the abnormality in the morphological form can be in any part of the sperm. Okay, so that is there. Then asthenospermia means the motility is the problem. Okay, so then we call it asthenospermia. Teratozoospermia is morphologically abnormal. Oligozoospermia is sperm count is less, number is less. Azoospermia means the sperm, there is no sperm in the semen sample. So these are the things. Now, when you have certain semen parameters problem, certain parameters, suppose it is a case of oligozoospermia. That means the sperm count is less. There are certain medications you can give, and then you repeat the sample again after 3 months. You give the medication for 3 months and repeat it after 3 months. But again, there are certain things. I mean, in semen analysis, certain prerequisites are there. That means the couple has to follow abstinence for 3 days before giving the semen sample, because that again has an effect on the semen parameters, even the count, motility, everything gets affected. So it should not be less than 3 days abstinence or more than 3 days abstinence. Both are bad. So that affects the semen parameters. So it has to be exactly 3 days of abstinence, after which you give a semen sample for analysis. Then, if it is a gross problem, suppose it's a somebody does a semen sample analysis and then it's found that he's having azoospermia. That means there's no sperm in the semen sample. Then what you do is you don't wait for 3 months. You basically do it again immediately. And then if it's the same thing, then you try to find out where is the problem. Okay. Sometimes what you do is there might be some obstructive problem in the vas and all. So that is why even if the sperm is formed, but it's not getting ejaculated. So in that case, you'll take a testicular biopsy, and from the seminiferous tubules, you'll be taking out the sperms. Now, if you get sperms in this case, that means it's an obstructive problem. That means the sperms are getting synthesized in the testes, but just that it's not getting ejaculated, and that is why the semen sample you get for analysis is having azoospermia. So that, I mean, that you should be able to differentiate, like whether the person is really having azoospermia, sperm is not synthesized in the body totally, or it's just that it's there in the testis, it's just that it's not getting ejaculated. Okay, so there lies the role of testicular biopsy. Now, next we'll go to the female infertility. Suppose there's no sperm, I mean the azoospermia we get like in testicular biopsy also, there's no sperm or there's no seminiferous tubules. So in those cases, you will ask for donor samples, okay? You will ask for donor samples and go ahead with artificial insemination. We'll be talking about it. Next, let us discuss about female infertility. Now, as an MBBS, you mostly concentrate on female infertility only, because male infertility is a bit, I mean, you just know what it is, what are the causes, but your questions will be mostly from this part. Now, in female infertility, basically it is divided into, it can be ovulatory dysfunction, okay, and ovulation is a cause of female infertility in 30 to 40% of cases. Then it can be a problem in the tubes, fallopian tubes, tubal factor infertility. Basically, patency is a problem. So 30% of the causes, it is tubal factor. Then it can be a uterine factor, or it can be a peritoneal factor. So what is most important is ovulatory and tubal factor. Okay. Now this question comes very commonly in your MBBS examinations. Like they'll ask you test for ovulation. So why do you need test for ovulation? To know whether the female infertility is because of ovulatory dysfunction or not. So in that, first you'll have to start from history. Okay, menstrual history. Now in menstrual history, if you ask the lady, if she is telling that she's getting menses regularly, okay, it's not irregular, it's regular menstruation, then you are almost more or less sure that she is ovulating. There's no problem in her ovulation. And then another thing that some ladies might also complain of some mid-cycle pain, which is known as Mittelschmerz pain. That also shows that she is ovulating. Then again, there's something called basal body temperature. Okay, basal body temperature. What happens is just before ovulation, there is 0.5 degree Fahrenheit fall in the body temperature, and after ovulation, there is again that 0.5 degree Fahrenheit rise in body temperature. That basically happens because after ovulation, progesterone comes into play. Yes, progesterone is secreted from the corpus luteum. So progesterone is basically a thermogenic hormone. Okay, and that is the reason why there is a rise in temperature of 0.5 degree Fahrenheit after ovulation. Because after ovulation, progesterone is the dominant hormone. Now, next test for ovulation is cervical mucus study. Okay, what we do is we ask the lady to do these tests on her own. I mean, there's something called spin Burkitt test. Okay, when the cervical mucus is stretched between two fingers, I mean the index finger and the thumb, then if she has ovulated, then it can be stretched to 8 to 10 centimeter. So that is spin Burkitt test. Next comes mid-luteal serum progesterone level. So around day 21 of a cycle, that is the mid-luteal phase, right? The luteal phase starts post-ovulation and ends with onset of menses. And the follicular phase starts with onset of menses and ends with ovulation. So mid-luteal phase will be around day 21. So around day 21, he'll ask her to give a serum sample for progesterone. And if it is more than 10 nanogram per ml, then you are more or less sure that yes, she has ovulated. Okay. So if it is more than progesterone level, more than 10 nanogram per ml, it shows that she has ovulated. And then you can also ask for ultrasound. When you do an ultrasonography, which is basically a transvaginal sonography, TVS, where you can appreciate the ovulation changes better than transabdominal. Here what happens is all along, if you have been monitoring the follicle, the dominant follicle, which was increasing in size, and suddenly after ovulation, when the ovum comes out, the ovum is liberated from the follicle, then the follicle is reduced in size, okay? Maybe it has gone up to some 20 mm in size just before ovulation. 17 to 20 mm is the usual size. After ovulation, when you do a TVS, you'll see that it has come down in size. The margins of the follicle are like it's not regular, okay, and there will be some sort of fluid in the pouch of Douglas, okay. So all these findings will show that the lady must have ovulated. So these are tests for ovulation. You might get a short note on it. So what are the tests basically? It's menstrual history, regular menses, then basal body temperature, cervical mucus study, then you'll do mid-luteal serum progesterone and ultrasound. Okay? So these are the tests for ovulation. Now, if you find that the lady is not ovulating upon doing those tests for ovulation, you label her as anovulatory. Okay, it's an anovulatory infertility where ovulatory dysfunction is there. So when ovulation is not happening, then what you ovulation induction agents. Okay, so what are these drugs? Clomiphene citrate is number one. Number two is aromatase inhibitors like letrozole. Then you have insulin sensitizers like metformin, gonadotropins like follicle stimulating hormone or human menopausal gonadotropin. All these are also given for ovulatory induction of ovulation. And then for ovulatory dysfunction, the most important, the most common cause is polycystic ovarian syndrome. This is a very common cause of anovulatory infertility. where after all these measures have been taken, if the lady is still not ovulating, what we do is laparoscopic ovarian drilling. Okay, we put the laparoscope, of course, under general anesthesia, and then we do some sort of drilling bilateral ovaries, okay, so that the stromal thickness is reduced. And if the stromal thickness of the ovaries are reduced, then it will be easier for the ovaries to ovulate. Okay, and that is the pathology. I mean, one of the pathologies in PCOD why they are having anovulation. Okay, so there are certain regimes for that also. For example, if you are giving clomiphene citrate, you give from day 2 for 5 days. Okay, and then you can start with 50 mg, you can even go up to 150 mg. Aromatase inhibitors like letrozole, you can do again from day 2 to day 5, day 2 for 5 days, you give them like clomiphene only. And the dosage is 2.5 mg OD to 5 mg OD. Okay. Insulin sensitizers like metformin, they are not as such ovulation induction drugs, but they help to induce ovulation along with clomiphene citrate or letrozole if she is not responding to clomiphene citrate or aromatase inhibitors. Okay. Suppose she is not responding to the above two drugs, then you'll add metformin, and that especially happens in again PCOD patients, polycystic ovarian disease. You add these metformin, insulin sensitizers. Gonadotropins are also given either singly alone, FSH or HMG, human menopausal gonadotropin, or it can be given along with clomiphene citrate or aromatase inhibitors. Okay. But one thing you should keep in mind that when you are putting the patient on these drugs, there has to be a regular follicular monitoring, because you should know the effect of your drugs, right? Suppose you are putting her on clomiphene citrate. First is baseline scan. Baseline scan is important. Day 2, before starting her on clomiphene citrate or aromatase inhibitors, you should get a TVS done, transvaginal scan done. You should know the number of follicles there present, and then you start her on clomiphene citrate or aromatase inhibitors from day 2 for 5 days. And maybe around from day 2 to 5 days, if you start, then it will be day 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Day 6, it will end. Okay? And then maybe around day 10, you call her again, you do a TBS again to see the effect of the drug. Whether you have a dominant follicle. Dominant follicle means the follicle which will attain a size of 10 mm, okay, or more. That will be the dominant follicle. And finally, you'll have to keep on monitoring, and finally, you'll see which dominant. Now, next is tubal factor infertility. The causes can be prior pelvic inflammatory disease. That is a very important cause. That is a very common cause which can cause blocked tubes. Okay, blocked fallopian tubes. Again, female genital tuberculosis is also an important cause of tubal factor infertility. Now, to find out the tests, you have this hysterosalpingography. You have hysterosalpingography, where it's basically a test to find out the tubal patency. Okay, whether you have blocked tubes or not. Here, what we do is we use a water-based radio-opaque dye, urographin. Okay, it's a very painful procedure, so proper analgesia needs to be given, and we inject the dye. Okay, per vaginum through the cervix, and then we do a fluoroscopic screening. We take photographs, X-ray pictures, and then we'll see, we inject about 15 ml of the dye. We'll see the cavity. Cavity is getting filled up with the dye. Finally, we'll see the tubal outline. The dye will flow through the tubes, and finally, there will be peritoneal spillage through the fimbrial opening of the tube. Now, there are many advantages of getting an HSG done, a hysterosalpingography. What happens is, if there is any intracavitary lesion, uterine in the, I mean, the endometrial cavity, there's an intracavitary lesion. For example, if there's a small fibroid, if there's a polyp, then we'll see in the X-ray picture that that part of the, SOL is not covered by dye. So you can find out like there must be an SOL, and that is why the shape of the cavity is usually triangular, which you'll not find. And then suppose if there's a block at the cornual end of either tube or both the tubes, then you'll not even see the dye passing through the fallopian tube. The fallopian tube outline will not be visible if the cornual ostia are blocked. Okay, so that is again another important information you get. And now, if it is not blocked, you see the dye passing through the cornual end and coming to the tubes. And then, suppose the fimbreal end is not open, fimbreal end is blocked, then you'll not see the peritoneal spillage. Okay, you'll not see the peritoneal spillage. You'll see the fallopian tube outline, but after that spillage is not there, that means the fimbria is blocked. So these, it's a very important investigation and imaging modality basically to find out the tubal patency. Okay. Next is laparoscopy and chromopertubation. In laparoscopy and chromopertubation also, what you do is you do laparoscopy, and then here also you get added information on HSG. Okay, HSG you have done, you know the patient has blocked tubes. Now on laparoscopy, when you pass the blue methylene blue dye through the cervix, okay, and then you are holding the laparoscope and seeing, then if the dye gets spilled through the fimbreal end, then you know that the tubes are patent. But sometimes what happens, the dye doesn't get spilled. That means the tubes are blocked. So that is an added thing. Another thing in HSG, what happens, the patient is not under anesthesia in hysterosalpingography. So because of spasm also, because of pain also, sometimes there is cornual spasm. And the dye is not, it doesn't pass through the cornual end, and you are not being able to see the tubes, and falsely you can just comment that she is having blocked tubes. Now when you do a laparoscopy under general anesthesia, that spasm thing will not be there because there will be no pain. And so if the tube is actually open, anatomically open, then the tube, the dye will definitely pass through the cornual end and then be spillage into the peritoneal cavity. Okay. Now next is hysteroscopy. Hysteroscopy is basically an instrument which is put inside the uterus through the cervix, and then there is a distension media which is generally normal saline or glycine 1.5%, and then you are able to see the inside of the cavity, if there's a polyp, if there's a fibroid. And what is important is in the same sitting, if you see a polyp which should be resected, you can resect and come out. So that is both diagnostic and therapeutic. Now if you have found out the tubal factor infertility, suppose I told you if the block is in the cornual end, you can even do a hysteroscopic cannulation. Okay, hysteroscopy when you do, your HSG, prior HSG before operation has shown that there is cornual blockage bilaterally, then hysteroscopy you'll do and you'll try to cannulate the cornual end bilaterally. Okay, and when you push the methylene blue dye now, you'll see that the block has opened. So hysteroscopically you have removed the block which was there in the cornua. Then fimbrioplasty, sorry, there's a spelling mistake here. It's fimbrioplasty, S-T-Y. So in fimbrioplasty, suppose there's a fimbrial block. Okay, so you can do some sort of surgery and then release the block. If there's some adhesions which is involving the tube, then also you can release those adhesions and see the tubes getting patent. Okay. Now, actually, what happens is tubal factor infertility, if it's there, and if the tubes are anatomically, when you do a laparoscopy, you see like they are really unhealthy tubes, then these maneuvers generally don't help. You actually suggest her to go for IVF, in vitro fertilization, because now we have an option which can make her pregnant. So why not give that opportunity? But this tubal factor infertility, embryoplasty, and adhesiolysis, it doesn't help much. Okay. So whenever you find the tubes are grossly unhealthy, you should suggest her to go for ART. Now in ART, you don't have to know much. It's a very difficult subject. I mean, for you, it's not that much required. Just that you should know it's assisted reproductive technology. Here you have intrauterine insemination. Here what happens? The semen is put inside the uterus through the cervix. Okay, so that increases the chance of conception. It is generally done when the semen parameters are altered. Suppose the count is less or something, then the chances of conception in natural intercourse will be less. So if you can process the semen and make it more concentrated and then put it inside the uterus, the chances of conception increases. Now again, there can be other indications, like suppose the male partner is having some disease, HIV or something, then also, I mean, you can get the semen sample. There's something called semen wash, which sort of washes the virus, and then you can put it inside. Then, if the semen, I mean, the male partner is having azoospermia, you want a donor sample. Then also, IUI is an option. You get the donor sample and do insemination. Okay. Now, IVF ET is in vitro fertilization, embryo transfer. Here, what we do is what in general terms we call test tube baby. Yes. So, what we do is we take the male gamete. We take the male gametes from where we get from the semen sample. Yes. And then the female gamete we get from the, that is known as oocyte retrieval. We put the lady on ovulation induction and then we see the follicles growing. I told you already, right? And then when the follicles are about to rupture, then you take out with the, you put her under general anesthesia and then you retrieve the ovum. And then you have the sperm, you have the ovum, and then what you do in petri dish, in culture media, you mix it, give it appropriate environment for fertilization, and then when the embryo becomes 8-cell stage, somebody even does it in the blastocyst stage, must be aware of these terms from embryology, then you put it inside the mother's womb. That is called embryo transfer. Okay, so that you do. Then you have something called ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection. Here, this is also done in case of major male infertility problems where the motility is not good of the sperm. So you take the sperm and put it inside the ovum under microscope. Okay, so that is ICSI. Fertilization, you are doing it on your own. In IVF, you just put the sperm and ovum in the culture media and they only attract each other and the sperm gets into the ovum. But in ICSI, you get hold of the sperm under the microscope and inject it into the cytoplasm of the ovum. Okay, so that is ICSI. Then there's something called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. Before all these procedures, you need to know if the couple, any of the couples has any genetic problem. This has to be ruled out and then you do it. That is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So that is all. If you have any query, you can ask.